Realism is one of those elements that can easily make or break a movie depending on how it's used. And I myself have made it clear that I believe movies are better off going for a more believable approach as opposed to always diving headfirst into hardcore realism, as I got into in another video which you can find a link in the description to. But that being said, there is a time and place for realism in movies, as with anything else. Because sometimes, going with a hyper-realistic approach is much better than playing more fast and loose with a given concept and taking it beyond what's actually possible. And today, I'd like to go over one of the best examples of a movie using realism to its fullest advantage, with that being The Truman Show. Because, simply put, this was one idea that wouldn't have been nearly as good if the writers hadn't tried to keep the whole thing as close to reality as they possibly could. And now would probably be a good time to note that there will be spoilers for this movie ahead. So in case for some reason you haven't seen it yet but plan to, you should probably come back to this video another day. Okay, so to put it simply, the geniusness of The Truman Show comes from the fact that it's based off a concept almost every single person has thought about at some point. What if our lives are nothing but a TV show? What if everything around us is actually manufactured and there are millions of people watching us every moment of our lives? Now, while most know, for various reasons, that can't actually happen, since TV's inception, that still hasn't stopped many from letting their paranoia get the better of them every once in a while. So with that already being an idea most people think about, The Truman Show takes that concept and shows what that would actually look like if that were to be the case. If a single person's life was turned into a TV show without their knowledge. And to give the writers their due credit, every detail is accounted for. Absolutely nothing is missed. For example, because the show is entirely focused around Truman, there can be no commercials, hence the heavy emphasis on product placement. And as some have noted, the show is also very well lit, not for the sake of Truman's comfort, but because, as also mentioned, everything on the show is for sale, so they want the audience to be able to see everything. In other words, if The Truman Show were to actually exist, product placement would be the most likely way for it to make money, and the movie realistically shows how it would go about doing that. And another interesting example is in its setup. Because let's face it, if the camera is going to follow somebody everywhere, it makes sense that they would keep him in a confined space so they'd have absolute control over everywhere he goes, and why they go to such desperate lengths to keep him from leaving. As simply put, if he were to leave the dome, the show would basically be over, which is exactly what happens at the end of the movie. But in addition to trying to keep him contained, there's also the placement of all the cameras, because once again, they have to ensure both that he doesn't realize they are cameras and that they can photograph him from any angle at all times. And once again, the attention to detail here is amazing, because not only can the viewer see all the cameras that are explicitly highlighted, but if one pays enough attention, they can spot cameras all over the set disguised as different things. And there's also how Truman starts to spot the threads that something's seriously wrong with his life. For example, considering he lives in a dome, it was basically inevitable that a piece of it would fall off eventually. And there's also how everybody that isn't a designated part of his life behaves around him. Because simply put, they don't act like normal people. When he stops in the middle of the street, the cars just stop. Normally you'd expect them to start honking their horns and yelling at him to get out of the road, but they don't react at all. Or the same thing when he gets on the bus. Everybody just sits there and doesn't say a word. No random conversations, nothing. And when the bus breaks down, everybody just gets up and leaves. And anybody who's ever been in that situation would know that people would be pitching a fit. And even somebody as isolated as Truman would be suspicious as to why nobody seems even a little aggravated. And then, of course, there's the more obvious stuff, such as why on earth two random people would grab a homeless man who looks just like his father and force him onto a bus, all the while ignoring his shouting, or why a random man he's never met knows his name. And there's also the stuff that pertains to Truman himself. Like, Christoph and the studio could adopt him, but they couldn't ensure he was the ideal person for their show. Because the kind of man that would fit the Truman Show perfectly would be very introverted, content to live a normal, non-eventful life, and be afraid to leave the comfort of his home and surroundings. But that's not who Truman is. From a very early age, it's obvious that he's the adventurous type that would gladly stand up to any challenge, outright saying he wanted to be an explorer. As a result, it makes sense that he desperately wants to leave his island where he's been forced to live all his life and see the world. But because of Christoph trying to mold him into the right person for his show, Truman is left frustrated and stuck in an existence he wasn't meant for. And the harder he tries to fight back against it, the more he can start to see that something is forcing him into his given life, making him push back even harder because that's who he is. And the other thing to keep in mind is what makes him start to question the circumstances of his existence in the first place, Sylvia. As once again, if a person's life were to really be a TV show, it's almost a given that the person or people they become attracted to might not be who the creators of the show had in mind, as among other things they'd have to ensure said person's cooperation. So as a result, he ends up with a woman who pretends to like him, but isn't able to sell it all that well, which honestly only motivates him to find his lost love even more. Because let's face it, if a person has a crush on somebody, and that crush appeared to like them back, and then they just suddenly disappeared, it makes sense that said person would want to find out what happened to them. And all of that only brings up another point here as well. Because the most realistic thing about the Truman Show is actually how fake it all is. It's just a bunch of extras roaming around a giant set, trying to act natural for this one man. The whole world literally revolves around him inside that dome. Now, if Christoph were smart, he'd have hundreds of extras actually set up a permanent residence and let them actually live their lives there. But because that would probably cost even more money, the bare minimum is made to maintain the illusion. Because apart from the aforementioned problem of the extras not having the realistic reactions to the situations Truman finds himself in, not many of them are actually very good actors. Which does make sense, as most talented actors would be off trying to make a career in the theater, movies, or their own TV shows. So the people willing to be on the show as just meaningless background extras would probably be towards the bottom of the barrel talent-wise, especially because there has to be so many of them. But that's what also leads to one of the most brilliant moments of realism on the movie's part. the fact that Truman still trusts Marlin long after he stopped trusting everybody else. Because not only is he supposedly his lifelong best friend, but he's actually a good actor to boot. That's why Truman continues to confide in him, because he actually sells the fact that he sees Truman as his best friend. He doesn't feel fake. And if deleted scenes are to be taken into account, that mainly comes from the fact that he does see him as a friend and feels guilty for lying to him. But all that being said, despite the movie being heavily realistic and having amazing attention to detail, that isn't to say that everything in it is totally true to life. Because, simply put, the premise alone could never actually happen, as I said before. As not only could a child not be adopted by a corporation, but the show violates so many privacy laws, it's not even funny, and in no way would ever be legal to broadcast. That's why on reality shows, the cast always has full knowledge of the fact that they're being filmed, as well as general final say on what can and can't be shown to the public. And there's also the fact that if a show like that did manage to get made, it probably wouldn't be nearly as successful as it was in the movie. Because even the most cynical person would have to admit that most people would not go for a TV show where a person's entire life was filmed and they know nothing about it. To put it another way, the Free Truman movement that's implied to exist in the movie would probably be a lot bigger in real life and would have basically ensured that it never even saw an air date. But even aside from that, there's also the fact that nobody inside the show seems to care for Truman. Again, apart from Marlin, who in deleted scenes is shown to feel immense guilt for the whole thing, everybody seems to be afraid of him at best, or just plain doesn't care about him at worst. His wife only married him because of what she could gain from him. And not to mention the actress playing his mother. Seriously, this woman practically raised him, and yet the apathy she feels for him just oozes off the screen. I'm sorry, but unless the producers specifically went looking for a high-functioning sociopath, that would just not happen in real life, no matter what agreements she made. And the actor playing his father is just as guilty of this. Because sure, he wanted to get back on the show, but only for the money, fame, and attention it would bring him. It doesn't matter if he didn't know Truman nearly as long. You'd think most people would care a bit more for the fact that not only did they pretend to be this boy's father, but also that they heavily traumatized him with his death. But again, barely anybody, both on set and behind the scenes, ever seemed to feel any guilt or affection for this man. And that's just not normal human behavior. And honestly, that's why the bus driver is such a notable character to many people, because he actually behaves like a human being. Sure, he does his job of sabotaging Truman, but he actually shows compassion for him and appears sorry that he had to do it. And again, that's how most people would actually behave in the same situation. My point in all of this is, in order for a premise like The Truman Show to actually work, it has to have a pretty dang cynical look on people and how they would treat Truman. Because again, in reality, there's no way the show would have ever gotten made, even if the government somehow allowed it. The backlash would have simply been too huge to go ahead with it. But honestly, none of that changes the fact that this movie still shows what a person living life oblivious to the fact that they're on a TV show would really go. Everything from the cameras to the product placement to the way Christoph controls every aspect of his life. It's all about as close to the real thing as it could possibly get. So real, in fact, that many paranoid schizophrenics have specifically singled out this movie when trying to describe the delusions they suffer from. That's how accurate it is to real life. And once again, in this case, that's definitely a good thing. As I've said in many other videos, more often than not, realism can drag a story down. But in this case, the movie heavily benefited from being as realistic as possible and only taking liberties when it was absolutely necessary. If it were less realistic and played more fast and loose with reality, it wouldn't be nearly as effective or good. Because as I said before, by being very realistic, it allowed the movie to show what an idea that so many people think about would actually look like. And not only did it show all of that really well, but also managed to say something pretty important and meaningful with it all as well. Alright, I think I've made my point with all of this. So now I'd like to hear from all of you. Do you believe that a movie like The Truman Show heavily benefits from being as realistic as possible? Or do you think that has nothing to do with why it's so good? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And thank you all for watching. It is all really appreciated. And I hope to see you all next time.